When the history of the Trump presidency is written, I think January 2026 will be important. For weeks now, Minnesota and St. Paul have been under a kind of siege. With federal agents sweeping the cities for undocumented migrants and reacting to protesters with violence. Then, on January 7th, an ICE agent killed Renee as she was in the process of driving a car away, followed just 2 weeks later by another shooting, this time of Alex Pretti.
There was absolutely no danger to any of these agents.
This second shooting caused a big reaction, even from Trump allies.
Tonight, President Trump facing a rare and growing backlash from members of his own party.
At least 30 Republicans are now demanding a full and complete and thorough investigation.
The NRA even speaking out, posting, "Responsible public voices should be awaiting a full investigation."
And unlike after previous ICE outrages, Trump mounted a retreat.
A very different tone coming out of the White House.
Gregory Bovino is out as part of a staffing shakeup.
You know, we have Tom Homan there now. We put him in there. He's great. We're going to de-escalate a little bit.
Over the past year, I've lost count of the number of times I've been told that public opinion doesn't matter anymore. Trump voters can't be persuaded, democracy is over, and protests are pointless.
And we can't end this without good men in the streets, armed and ready to protect innocent people from being gunned down.
Oddly, the skepticism of protests and organising is matched by many centrist types who view much of the activism of recent years as counterproductive and who have almost sneered at the word resistance. But right now, protesters and activists in Minnesota have forced at least partial retreat from Trump. By using tactics direct but non-violent that are changing how many are thinking about opposing Trump and that look likely to spread to other parts of America. And so I think this episode, which is a mix of victory and tragedy, is worth understanding at a deeper level. For what it reveals about when protests are effective and when they're not, how to avoid the traps that those in power set for protesters and activists, and how Trump's entire enterprise can be brought crashing down. So before we get into what happened in Minneapolis, I want to talk about how organising and protesting can work at a strategic level. First, such actions can work directly. Blocking off a vehicle, for example, stops ICE from doing their job. Protests are also important ways to bind a movement and build commitment amongst those involved. But probably the most important role for protest is as a tool to influence public opinion. The best known example, of course, is the civil rights marches of the 1960s.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In that conflict, there were two sides with two competing narratives, the civil rights advocates and those in opposition. Now, on any given political issue, you have a spectrum of opinion, those strongly on one side, those strongly on the other, and many undecided people in the middle, in the grey zone. But as conflict increases, the natural result is that people in the middle are pressured to choose, and the result is a general polarisation into two sides. Protests and activism feed into this because they create what we might call conflict visuals. For example, one of the most famous photos of the civil rights era was this photograph of a 15-year-old protester being attacked by police dogs that appeared across front pages in America and the world. In this visual, there is a conflict between the two sides, and the viewer is naturally drawn to side with one or the other. But while some will polarise towards supporting the police officer, most people who saw the image were drawn to support the protester. This was the case with many of the conflict visuals from the civil rights era, with protesters being hit by fire hoses, arrested and beaten. Key to the success, of course, was nonviolence.
I do believe that if the nonviolent resistors continue to follow the way of nonviolence, they eventually get over to the hearts and souls of the former oppressors.
Martin Luther King's nonviolence was deeply rooted in Christianity, a belief that violence was wrong and a desire to change the hearts of those opposing the movement. But it was also strategically effective because the conflict visuals it created worked in his side's favour. On one side, unarmed citizens exercising their rights. On the other, armed agents of the state using force. It's important to note that nonviolent didn't mean the marchers weren't confrontational. They knew a reaction would be likely, but they also knew that the resulting visuals were likely to work in their favour. In fact, in a move that's kind of shocking today, the civil rights marchers had children taking part in the action, knowing that the conflict visuals would be all the more powerful and persuasive as a result. Now, the bad news for the left is that the conflict visuals from protests are not always helpful. For example, after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, there was widespread rioting, violence and arson in cities across America. Unlike the civil rights visuals, these conflict visuals polarised more voters into opposition to the left. In the presidential elections of that year, Richard Nixon took advantage.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States.
finally winning in a landslide. We saw this dynamic more recently in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's murder. Things started, tragically, with a conflict visual that won wide public support for the movement. But with the looting, riots and arson, public support quickly fell from 67% to around 50%. And the stage was set for the retreat of BLM and wokeness more generally in the years after. Now, I'm not saying this process is right, but it is a reality. And it's clear that Trump and his people are trying to use this dynamic to their advantage.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars.
This actually seems to be why Trump picked Minneapolis as a target for ICE operations. The city has a large Somali American community, one that includes Ilhan Omar, a Minneapolis congresswoman who Trump has repeatedly clashed with. Then, in late 2024, a video by YouTuber Nick Shirley reignited interest in a long-running federal fraud scandal that had led to the convictions of dozens of Somali Americans.
We're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage.
Now, few of this group are undocumented migrants. In fact, according to one estimate, the entire state only has 5,000 Somalis who are not US citizens. So you've got Ilhan Omar, fraudsters, and a group that, and I would be shocked if this wasn't part of the thinking, a group that is both black and Muslim. You've also got the fact that Minneapolis was the scene of rioting in 2020 after George Floyd was killed there. So when ICE and federal agents went in so aggressively to Minneapolis, knowing protests and resistance would follow, it seems part of the thinking was to create a conflict visual of Trump, ICE and the forces of order on one side, and radicals, protesters, immigrants and fraudsters on the other. A contrast that would help boost Trump and his agenda. Ever since their operation started in Minnesota, the administration has pushed this narrative, and especially after the killing of Renee Good.
This was an act of domestic terrorism.
Probably a paid agitator, but in my opinion, she was an agitator, a very high-level agitator.
But despite its best efforts, the administration has, from the start, struggled to make this narrative stick. Instead of paid agitators, it's been ordinary people organising against ICE.
Jan was very nervous.
I was scared. I've never had two guns.
I've never had a gun pointed at me before in my life. And to think that these individuals represent
our government.
Thousands have joined signal groups to track federal agents. Local faith groups and networks first formed after George Floyd was shot are being used to organise deliveries of food to immigrant families that are in hiding, or to help them by taking their kids to school. Others have volunteered as ICE Watch, guarding locations like schools with whistles to alert the neighbourhood to the presence of agents, usually identifiable by their SUVs with out-of-state plates. This resistance isn't organised in a top-down way, a fact that makes it harder to claim that they're all paid agitators, and also makes it harder to suppress. Hundreds of ordinary people have also attended training sessions where they're encouraged to record ICE operations but not to interfere.
We're very clear. We're not here to stop any enforcements. We're here to observe and document them.
However, many of those involved have aimed to stop enforcements, following ICE vehicles, beeping their horns, sometimes blocking their cars in or obstructing them from moving. This is a new style of disruption, one that emerged in LA last year and was refined and developed in Chicago and is now being perfected in Minneapolis. It's a type of civil disobedience, confrontational but still non-violent, that has similarities with the deliberate law-breaking of the civil rights marches and looks likely to be a big part of how ICE will be resisted in other liberal cities. There have been uglier moments. A hotel smashed up, fireworks and objects thrown, but for the most part the strategic logic of non-violence has cut through.
I am personally very committed and preach nonviolence, for not just because of ethics, but because I think it's what's strategic. I don't want to give them any ground to claim that anything they do is justified.
The result of all this restraint and discipline in the face of extreme aggression has been really effective, not only in helping immigrant families directly and in impeding the actions of federal officers, but also in creating a series of conflict visuals that have not fitted the story the Trump administration had wanted to present. When Renee Good was shot, she was, as we've heard, demonized as a paid agitator and as the aggressor. But the video told its own story. An ordinary looking woman, not aggressive, with the shooter's last words an expression of pure aggression. And things really fell apart when Alex Pretti was shot.
And White House advisor Stephen Miller cast Pretti as a domestic terrorist and an assassin.
Of course, the administration tried to push its normal narrative.
This individual who came with weapons and ammunition to stop a law enforcement operation of federal law enforcement officers committed an act of domestic terrorism. That's the facts.
Again, however, the video clearly contradicted this version of events. When you see the video, you see a man acting non-violently, recording with a phone, not brandishing a weapon, with the violence and aggression coming from the federal officers, all before he's shot without justification whilst on the ground. The visual was bad, and as more details emerged that Pretti was an ICU nurse in a veterans hospital,
today we remember that freedom is not free.
Things looked worse than ever. Later, video would emerge of Pretti in a separate earlier incident kicking a federal vehicle, a visual that might have helped, if not justified, the administration's narrative. But in the days after, the picture of a brutal shooting was just too powerful, especially when it came after a countless string of other conflict visuals that were politically damaging to the administration. To Trump's credit, he understands television and visuals, and he clearly decided that, even if it was only for a time, he would have to retreat, not something that happens often. Okay, so what are the wider lessons of all this? Well, first I should say this is clearly not the end of ICE or aggressive deportations. Also, it's true that the incompetence of Trump's people plays a massive role in this. Even if you don't care about the morals, it's clearly bad politics to arrest cute kids in blue bunny hats. It's self-defeating to undertrain your agents so they look less like a police force and more like a gang. It's a bad idea to lie so obviously when people can see things with their own eyes. And it's not wise to put a guy in charge who seems to be trying to look like a Nazi in every detail from his haircut to his trench coat. But I think the main credit for this rare opposition win should go to the protesters and organisers in Minneapolis. Because these people stayed away from violence, rioting and arson, actions that would have changed the conflict visual and justified, for many voters, tough tactics from federal officers. And by encouraging people to record with their phones, they allowed the underlying reality of the lawlessness, excess and violence of federal officers to be revealed. More widely, I think this question, what is the conflict visual that emerges from our actions and will it help us win support, should be remembered. In fact, one protest action in Minneapolis shows what happens when this question is forgotten. This was a bad conflict visual. On one side, brash shouting protesters, on the other side, churchgoers on Sunday morning forced to comfort their kids. With added explanation, it might just about make sense, but on a raw visual level, it failed.
No, you live an easy life, don't you? A very easy life while people are starving.
And you see this too often on the left. In the UK, we had a series of climate protests that seemed to pitch activists against ordinary commuters, or activists against much-loved works of art. Such acts are often justified as raising awareness, but the conflict visuals are clearly negative for winning public support. A better visual was created by these climate protesters, taking action against the private jets of rich people. A visual of underdogs versus the rich and powerful, which is much more effective at winning people over. Another lesson I think is worth taking away from all this is that America is not a dictatorship yet. Since Trump came to power, I've often predicted that his approach to politics will backfire. But in response to this, I often get a lot of feedback from a kind of lefty nihilism point of view. An argument that all Trump voters are extremists who will never change their mind, unreachable because of right-wing media, and that under this authoritarian system, hard coercive power is the only option. Alongside this comes a skepticism of protests, a belief that they change nothing and that the answer is riots, arson, and even political violence.
I don't understand how you're struggling to follow that they're gonna keep killing us if we don't end this.
At the same time, more centrist types have become skeptical of activism, believing rightly that elections are the most important way to defeat Trump, but also believing, based on recent experience, that protests and activism tend to be counterproductive in winning support from voters. But I think the events of Minneapolis are counter to all this skepticism. First, Trump voters are clearly not all MAGA diehards, considering how much we see his support falling recently. Also, we can see that these events in Minneapolis have cut through, despite the media system, to ordinary voters. But also, we've seen how ordinary people protesting and organising, not seeking online recognition or clout, doing the activism that is so often sneered at, can, with restraint and discipline, be highly effective. And I think all of those who oppose Trump's agenda should take a moment to salute that. Hi, thanks for watching. My name is Brendan. I have a very exciting Substack I would love you to sign up to. It gives you a free email whenever I publish a video, but I also do a regular list of links and interesting things to go and see. There's also, if you go to one of the paid options, there's regular videos, kind of a bit behind the scenes stuff, things I'm seeing and sharing with my audience. So yeah, I'd love you to go and check all that out.